I'm going to do the chapter 5 review for Jeopardy. As you guys are looking at this at home, make sure that you're trying the problems on your own. You can pause the problems and work them before you see my solutions. I'm going to do videos on each of the following categories: inverse functions, review of logarithms, exponential functions, logarithmic functions, and inverse trig functions. All right, so let's start with the first one. The first one says, find the inverse of the function f of x equals 14 minus 7x cubed. All right, so I'm going to instead of f of x, I'm going to write y. So y equals 14 minus 7x cubed. I'm going to replace my x and y values. Basically, this is just reflecting on my function across the line x equals or y equals x. All right, then I'm going to solve for the new y values. So I'm going to subtract 14. I'm going to divide by -7. So when I divide by -7, I'm going to divide by a negative on the top and the bottom. So the top becomes negative x plus 14, and the bottom is just now 7. But usually I'll write that as 14 minus x. So I kind of usually do that step in y equals y cubed. And I take the cube root of both sides, so I get the cube root of 14 minus x all over 7 equals y. And y was f of x originally, but now since I switched my x and my y values, it's f inverse of x. So it's the cube root of 14 minus x all over 7. Or you might see it written as the cube root of 2 minus 1/7 x, or x to the 7, either way. Okay, the 200 problem. So find the inverse of the function g of x equals 3x minus 1 all over x plus 4. All right, so g of x is your y value. Switch your x and your y values. And we're going to solve for this new y value. I'm going to multiply y plus 4, so my denominator, over to the other side. I'm going to distribute my x. And this is usually where people kind of don't know where to go. I'm trying to solve for y, so we want to get everything that has y on one side, and everything that doesn't have y on the other side. I'm just going to subtract the 4x over. That allows you to pull out what they have in common, the y value. Now I can divide by the x minus 3, so I get y equals negative 4x minus 1 all over x minus 3. And y was g of x before, so now it's g inverse of x since I switched my x's and y's. So you might see it as negative 4x minus 1 over x minus 3. But the way I would probably write it, and it would probably be written on like a multiple choice question, would be 4x plus 1, so divided by a negative on top, so I have to divide by a negative 1 on bottom. So instead of having x minus 3, I'm going to have negative x plus 3, or 3 minus x. So that's the way I would probably see it written. And the next one says find the inverse of the function x squared plus 4 for x is greater than or equal to 0. Now the reason we have a restricted domain that's x squared is greater than or equal to 0 is because x squared plus 4, it's like x squared only it's shifted up 4. And if you remember, if I'm going to find the inverse of something, it has to be 1 to 1. So in other words, it has to pass the 4-1 test. So this one's not 1 to 1 because for two different x values, it has the same y value. So that's why they restrict the domain. So we're only talking about the right half of this function. And that part is 1 to 1. Okay, so when I'm finding the inverse, I'm going to switch my x and my y like before and solve for y. But when I take the square root of something, I have to write plus or minus. So I get plus or minus the square root of x minus 4. But since it's 1 to 1, there has to be one unique inverse. So which one is it? Is it the plus or is it the minus? So think of your points. If I plugged in, let's say 0 for x before, I got 0, 4. So that means on this one, I better get 4, 0. Otherwise, they're not inverses. So if I plug in 4, that's how I get 0. That doesn't really tell us much, is the plus or minus. Let's try another point. Let's say I plug in a 1. If I plug in 1 on the original, 1 squared plus 4 is 5. So now when I plug in 5, I should get 1 out. When I plug in 5, I get 2, because I get plus or minus 1. That means y is equal to the positive 1. The square root of x minus 4. Now, I wouldn't leave it as y. That wasn't what your original was y, right? But we don't have y in the end. We have y inverse. So I write it as y inverse. Okay, a lot of people want to write that as f inverse, but be really careful. There was no f defined. So unless you define it, then you can call it the inverse of f. But we never talked about f in our properties. Okay, the next one, it says, suppose g is the inverse of f, and f of 2 equals 7, and f prime of 2 equals 3 over 2. Find g prime of 7. All right, so since g was the inverse of f, g was f inverse. So what we're really trying to find is f inverse prime of 7. Okay, so if you remember from your textbook, that was a formula, and I told you you never will have to memorize this formula. So in the test, I'll give it to you. But I have seen it on one multiple choice question. So in all the years of multiple choice questions, I've only seen it pop up once. Now, if you remember in class, we talked about what it means. If I have some kind of function, this is really hard to tell into, but it's reflected across the line y equals x for its inverse. Those are some squiggles. That was pretty bad. Should have made it easier. So it's something like that. So basically, if you're finding the slope, like right here, the slope of the other one is going to be the reciprocal. So if the slope was 3 over 2, the slope would be 2/3. And that's all it's really saying. All right, so f prime, or f inverse prime is 7. So if I have f of 2 equals 7, I know f inverse of 7 equals 2. So that might be useful information. So let's start from the beginning. So if I have f inverse prime of 7, that's going to be 1 over f prime of f inverse of 7. Well, f inverse of 7 we just found, so it was 2. So I have f prime of 2, and 1 over f prime of 2. F prime of 2 is 3 over 2. That was our problem. So it's reciprocal, 3 over 2, which is 2. So that's all there is to it. It's not bad at all. Okay, this next one, it says if f of x equals 2x plus cosine of x, find f inverse prime of 1. So same kind of thing. So f inverse prime of 1 is 1 over f prime of f inverse of 1. Okay, it's not quite as easy as the last one to have a point before. So let's think about it. So if I'm finding f inverse of 1, I'm basically trying to find when is f of x equal to 1. So f of x was 2x plus cosine of x. Let's think about it. Let's think of these numbers. So what about 0? If I plug in 0, I get 2 times 0 plus cosine of 0. Let's see what that equals. See if it equals 1. Well, cosine of 0, if you can put in your circle, here's where 0 is. The cosine value is your x value, that was the point 1, 0. The cosine of 0 is 1. So I have 0 plus 1, that is equal to 1. So that's what we want. So f of 0 is equal to 1. So that means f inverse of 1 equals 0. So 1 over f prime of 0. So f prime of 0, we need to find that. Well, f prime of f is, look at your original, the derivative is 2 plus, the derivative of cosine is negative sine, so negative sine of x. So 2 minus the sine of x. So f prime of 0 is 2 minus the sine of 0. Looking back up at your unit circle, the sine of 0 is 0. So this is just 2. So your answer is 1/2. Alright, that's the end of inverse function.